All right. Welcome everybody to the Cross-Organizational Data Group. Today we have Paul Crickard, who has some pretty insightful experience on working in government, working with government, across agencies, and I'm sure a number of great stories to tell. So with that, I'll let Paul kick it off.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. A little background about me is I'm not technically a tech person. I did my undergraduate work and graduate work in political science, right? So I grew up in Maryland, went to Maryland, came out west to Utah State to do my master's degree, took a job doing research in Florida, got bored, came back to grad school, wanted to be out west, moved to New Mexico to do a master's degree in urban planning because I started wanting to be more technical instead of theoretical. And I ended up getting a job, and that was the whole point of school. So I dropped out after I finished all my coursework, never did my thesis, and just started working in planning. Planning led me to geospatial. So I started doing heavy GIS work, and that led to a lot of data work, right? I started doing GIS using Esri and doing map stuff, and then I realized this is all just data. So I started getting heavy into data, and that transitioned into becoming a tech person, right? It transitioned into now I work at the IT department doing spatial instead of the engineering division. So I took a job in government. I took a break from work when we had our son, decided to go back to work, and I went to work for the city of Albuquerque. And I took a job at the police department. So I was an analyst doing data analysis and crime analytics for the police. And then I left there to do engineering again with the city. And then I took my dream job with the district attorney in Bernalillo County. We had a district attorney who was very progressive and really wanted to do data. He believed data would help with all our problems. He brought in people from Sandia National Labs, and they hired me to be their chief information officer and to run their data efforts. In this role, we owned no data. We had zero data that we held on our own. It was all held by somebody else. And we had to share data, get data. And this is the heart of where my cross-organization data sharing comes from. And all my stories will come from this kind of law enforcement area. But I took some notes here. And I think when I think about my data sharing and dealing with other organizations, the issues I've experienced really come down to three areas, right? There's the technical area for data sharing, and you're all, I'm sure, extremely familiar with the technical challenges of data sharing. But then there's also this bureaucratic issue of dealing with government workers, government employees. It's not necessarily different than the private sector, but there are some differences. And then there's this overreaching one that's extremely hard to solve. There's no easy solutions, but that's the political issues in data sharing. And those tend to be the ones that I found to be the hardest, especially as tech people, because we might be able to solve problems extremely easy and be able to do amazing things, but political issues get in the way, and you can't just remove those barriers. So I'll start with the technical issues that I've run into. And in government, a lot of times, and at least my experiences at the city of Albuquerque, tend to be that they're not really set up to treat data as anything other than a byproduct of work. Right? It's like in engineering, we track our projects. We might draw spatial data lines to show where projects are on a map, and we'll label them, or we'll record costs. But none of these things are actually seen as data products as much as it's the data I need to do my job day to day. I don't really think about sharing it with anyone. I don't know how important it is. My bosses may look at it, but it's just viewed as something I do myself to do work. I mean, there was an engineer at municipal development that had 20 years of engineering data in an Access database that he wrote himself on his local machine with custom forms. This incredible data system that nobody even knew about. And he was tracking it, but we couldn't share it because no one even knew it existed. But to him, it was just something he kept, but it was probably more data than anyone at the city had ever seen in their life on these engineering projects. And so with that being said, the way things are set up, like I mentioned in Access, things aren't set up necessarily at the enterprise level, making them harder to share. And when you ask to share data, my experiences have been CSVs. It's somebody has data in the database and they'll share it with you. But to do so, it means somebody has to extract a CSV, dump it somewhere for you to pick up and put where you want it to go. And then this will get scheduled on some interval. And that is the extent of data sharing. Occasionally, you can do things like, well, I have a SQL server, so I'm going to give you VPN access to my network and I'll create an account on the server and I'm going to give you full access to my production system, but please don't break it. So when I was at the DA's office, I needed to get crime reports from the police department. That is in a proprietary system. It's not in a warehouse, and all they have is a production system for police reports and calls. We asked to see the data as the DA because it would help us to be able to build our cases and to do our work and to do some crime analytics on our own. To get this data, it's exactly what happened, is that they literally gave me an account on their production database back end of their commercial system and a VPN account to a city network so that I could run any query I wanted at any time, with the caveat is I'm not allowed to break 911, the calling system, right? Like I have full access to a police database. Yeah, they closed off some tables and set up some restrictions on what I could see, but I could run a horrible query. My SQL is not very good, right? I'm a political science major. So I could run a query that'll shut down your system in no time, right? I could write a for loop that lasts forever. So it's CSV or dangerous. It was a tough situation, but now that technical solution was also hindered by a political solution in that the person who had access to the data to provide to me did not want to provide that data. The city attorney had to be brought in to force a government employee to share data with another organization. And there are several reasons why this had happened. And one of them is you have a mayor in a city and you have a district attorney, both who are elected officials from the same party. Both are rising stars. Both want to be the one responsible for bringing down crime in a jurisdiction. Sharing data becomes a political liability, one, because I can see all the bad things people are doing or all the things that are falling through the cracks. I could expose the people I'm working with and their failures, or I could be the savior. I could come in and I could use this data for good, and all of a sudden my organization is getting credit for doing amazing work and this other organization is not. And they're the ones that hold the data, and everyone's going to ask, well, how come you weren't able to do this? And they were. They must be better than you. And it sets an environment of competition instead of collaboration, especially when you're working in departments with elected officials or appointed officials. And even if they're lifelong bureaucrats, everyone kind of wants to carve out that section of power in an organization and be responsible for some tasks. So sharing of this data, yeah, there were technical issues, but honestly, the biggest issue is nobody wants to be exposed or shown up. So another example was the court system offered to share data, but they did so by wanting to include a document that said we are only allowed to use the data in ways they specify, and no calculations can be performed on the data unless it follows the formula they provide. So we wanted to look up conviction rates on our conviction rates primarily. We wanted to calculate conviction rates and dismissals. So we were going to use court rulings to determine if a case was convicted or dismissed. Well, the courts have basically said you have to use our definition of dismissals and convictions, and you cannot calculate this any other way because the way we calculate is the only way you're allowed to do it. And so we had these arguments where if I define my methodology, I should be allowed to calculate anything I want. But they wanted to put restrictions on how you can analyze data that they were sharing. And it's, part of this is public data. A lot of it is shared publicly anyway. The problem is the methods by which they're shared publicly are too slow for analysis. It's usually through a website where you can one-off search individual records. You can't large extractions. So provide a certain way. But the idea that a government agency would share data under the conditions that you can't perform any math or analysis on data unless you do it the way they say is like, to me, that's kind of unheard of. Until I looked at the open data policy for the city of Albuquerque, which also says any data that they share, they have the right to tell you to take down any derivative product or any graph or chart that you make from that data if they don't like it. Like some lawyer really put in a thing saying you can download this data all you want, but if we decide the way you're using it, we don't like it, we can tell you to stop using it at any point. Which again, I'm not a lawyer, but that doesn't seem like it would ever hold up in court. But I think what it does is shows the fear of organizations, this fear that they're going to share data and they're always just afraid someone's going to do something to hurt them with it. That someone's going to take this open data or this data that they've decided to share, and they're going to use it to punish them, or they're going to expose them. We're going to be able to look behind the curtain and realize these things aren't as good as everyone's made them seem to be. That this automated system that they bragged about on the news really is 4 people pressing buttons and making this thing run. You know, it's not automated. This $1 million is a hot mess when you look in the back. And I think that really becomes a problem. You look at open data portals that a lot of people have set up, you know, back, I don't know, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it was this huge deal and everyone was setting up these open data portals. But you look at what data they chose to share, and it was always these kind of benign, harmless data sets, only describing where things are. It's like, here's our roads, here's our parks, right? There are these data sets that, yes, they're nice, but they're not anything that you can really get much insight from. They're really harmless. Right? Occasionally they'll share, like the city of Albuquerque did share employee salaries. When employee salaries went live on the open data portal, nobody worked for like a week. Every government employee just downloaded the data and wanted to know if the moron next to them was making more than them or not, right? It's like, who do I hate? Do they make more than me? Right? Everyone's just looking up what everyone else makes and where they rank in this system. And so things like that discourage opening of data sets that could be damning, right? I don't want to show my budgets in any meaningful way. I'll put it in a PDF, rolled up, consolidated, no line items. There it is, right? I don't want you to get into this nitty gritty of this data set because it might harm me. And an example here in Albuquerque, again on political, is that between organizations is one thing, but there's also within organizations. Employees are political within their own organizations. People want to get ahead. People want to be seen as valuable. The governor of New Mexico, I think one of the things Andrew saw that I mentioned was the police department was bragging about a new software they have, which allows you to see on your phone the location, the last known address of somebody who has a warrant. So the presumption is if you're driving around and you see, oh, look, around the corner, there's a guy with a warrant who's supposed to live there. Maybe I should stop by his house and see if I can go arrest him, right? But they bragged about this, and I'm willing to bet they spent a ton of money on this system. But the system is literally just geocoding addresses that exist in a CSV that somebody spits out every week. This isn't a technically advanced system. Well, the governor said she wanted this, and she put it out for all organizations to create this warrant backlog tool that would round up people with warrants. So at the DA's office, we decided to build a mobile app, and we were going to build this application ourselves, and we did on dummy data. And the problem was nobody could get the warrant data once the governor said that this is something she wanted to do. Every organization wanted to be the one that solved this problem. The state police wanted to build it. The local police wanted to build it. The DA wanted to build it. State IT wanted to build it. So whoever held the data held it as closely as they could. Now that's between agencies, but within our own agency, we had people who knew how to we had one person who knew how to get that data, knew where it was, and had received that data. That one person would not give up the data to our own organization. They held that data so close that when they did share it, it was in like pieces, it was redacted. To our own organization, this person knew how valuable that information was and where it could get them. And they ended up getting a job at a different organization doing exactly that with the data, right? Like, I think that could have been part of the leverage to move ahead. So even in this, inside the organization, there are people who necessarily aren't willing to share data. There's people who capture the same data multiple times, right? Everyone is using the data for their work. They're all capturing their own spreadsheet. They're not sharing it. When we tried to build analytics at the DA's office, you'd find that all these people were tracking data, but they wouldn't tell you about it, again, because they saw it as data used for their work, not as a product. Another issue, again, I guess within organizations, I had a case where we got the police data. We would spend weekends loading millions of records into Elasticsearch, and we were doing everything we could to just comb through these massive reports. We were doing text of the narratives, geospatial, looking for names, license plate numbers, anything we could do with this data. We just dump it in and then just jam away on it in Elastic. Well, we had an analyst department that would take data that was shared with some analysts at the police department, and they would add data that we had to this data set. Well, one day we invited the police department in to see what we were doing with our data, right? With the data, these stacks we had built. We saw it more as a tech thing, saying, look at these things we've built. These tools are really powerful. Come take a look. When one of the managers saw a data set we were using, an analyst from the police department made a comment that, oh, that's just our data, and they add a couple columns to it. That's nothing, right? Like, they're taking shots at this data set that they shared that we improved upon. And it was almost as if it was like a slight that we built upon their data and we're kind of sharing it back to them. They almost saw it as an insult of like, you don't think we're capable of doing this ourselves. But the reality is, it's not that you're not capable. It just might be that you don't have the time, you don't have the resources. We hold that data, so we're adding to this set and willing to share it back. But it almost becomes a fight in an organization on, well, how come their analysts over here are doing this and you're not? And you're trying to prove your value in the organization. And so these analysts wanted to look like they were more valuable than analysts at a different organization, instead of realizing that everyone has a different piece they can add to this puzzle. And if we pass these data sets around and everyone adds their piece, it becomes more valuable to everybody. And so I think one of the other issues, I guess, we'll take it to the individual employees again, is this bureaucratic issue, right? They're not product owners. One, data is not a product in a lot of these places. It's a byproduct of some work that's being accomplished. My job is to approve applications. My job is to prosecute cases. The data I enter on the case, I enter for myself. I enter my notes so that I can go back and look at them. I enter evidence. Some of it gets submitted to the court. Some of it's for me to put the pieces together. But it's not a product that I'm packaging and sharing, right? The data quality might vary from case to case, consistency, update times, when it's refreshed. These things are not, there's no SLA. This isn't set in stone. It's just something I do. So when data is shared, or you ask an employee of an organization to share data, I get the feeling that they feel like this is a new task. This is a new job duty, right? You're putting a job requirement on me to now be a product owner of a data set. And now Bob wants this data daily. And then he's going to complain that some of the fields aren't filled in, or that there's typos, or that I put in commas or special characters. And now I have to take my time away from what I perceive my job to be to manage this spreadsheet over here. Or in the DA's office, one of the things people were very concerned about was we would use this data to evaluate performance. That really, we wanted people to share data within the organization, so again, we could use it against them. Why are you losing cases? Why are you dismissing cases? Why are you taking this long to do your work? They almost viewed it as a way to micromanage. And they didn't see data as a way to make the office better, but a way to track the work they're doing and to see how productive they were as employees. I don't know how much time do I have here. I'm going to wrap up with one story that I found that kind of covers all these things, but shows kind of like the worst possible scenario of data sharing. The legislature in New Mexico offered grants to any agencies who could develop a way to share law enforcement data, criminal justice data. And they were giving out a ton of money to anyone who submitted proposals. They were going to try to pass them out throughout the state evenly, so everyone had a shot at getting this. We put together a committee of like 7 different agencies ranging from city, county, jail, state, all different jurisdictional levels, all different parts of the criminal justice system. We sat in meetings weekly for hours. We spent months coming up with what we thought would be valuable things that each agency could share. The way we did this, though, was every agency said what they thought would be valuable to them, and that became an ask on another agency. I think it'd be valuable if the jail told me every person they arrested every night. That would make my job easier. And the jail says, well, that's really difficult for us. How are we supposed to do that? What we would like is for the court to tell us who needs to show up to court every day so that we can do this. So everyone had their individual needs, and everyone was kind of looking for that one piece of information that would make their job easier instead of the system as a whole. That was problem 1. 2 was the technical challenge of anything we asked anyone to share, they didn't know how they would go about sharing it. Part of this is due to the fact that a lot of the data systems are proprietary, right? One of the worst examples is our court system could not see their own data from any non-front end website. Like they could not go into the database. They had very limited access to run anything against the actual database. And it was a violation of their terms and conditions of the product to run any query on a database that would be like a select star. They were only allowed to retrieve a certain number of records from select tables. So they didn't even, when they were given access, they weren't given full access to their own data. So they couldn't even share the data with anyone else, let alone even see it themselves fully in a way outside of this product. Well, we developed ideas, we ranked them, and we were getting ready to submit a proposal. Well, then a hippo showed up. And I don't know if anyone knows what a hippo is, but it's either the highest paid person in the office or the highest paid person, the most important person in the room. Somebody came in from the organization that was kind of running the meetings and decided on their own that this is what we were going to submit as an application and this is what was needed, and everyone signed on. So all the work we did as a multi-agency task force to determine what we needed and rank our priorities was outdone by a single agency who decided they were just going to take control because they were tasked with leading these meetings. They were going to decide what they wanted, and that was what was going in. So they applied for the grant with their idea. It turned out one of the other people on the committee secretly went behind everyone's back and applied for a grant on their own to do a data portal, and they were going to share all their data through a portal. Well, they actually received a ton of money that was set aside for our county. They won, they beat us. So they were a member of this group, went outside the group and did it on their own because they needed funding and to strengthen their own organization. They got a bunch of money. Our idea got pity money. So they threw some money at us, but the idea was so bad because it was not a joint project. It was a single agency taking control. Well, the other agency built their product. It was actually pretty good. They implemented Socrata. They put data in a portal. They actually shared data. We had to come up as a group again with a new project using this money we received to do something else. They didn't like our idea, so we had to do something else. So we got together and came up with some other ideas, started implementing an idea, and the idea was to share data from the jail. After months of working on this, it turns out the jail had already implemented this with somebody else and had never told anyone in the meetings that they were secretly doing this project again with another agency with more money to do it better than they were doing it in the group. They had no confidence in the group and the sharing among agencies that they decided to just go do it on their own. This is the second group that broke off. So this grant went nowhere. I think the money had to be returned. Nothing ever came of this agency sharing because of, I think, partly everyone wanted to make sure they got a piece of the pie, but they wanted the piece for themselves. They didn't want to share it necessarily, right? And because we didn't have a single idea, but we had ranked orders of what's important to everyone else, everyone just wanted to do what was important to them, but they wanted to make sure they didn't lose this money because all governments want more money, right? And so, yes, some data sharing happened, but it happened on the terms of agencies. And the best data sharing was through a portal, but I don't think portals are the best way to share data. Data portals, as I mentioned earlier, tend to share kind of harmless data. It's not necessarily what people want. It's what you want to share in a method you want to share it, not how they necessarily want to access it. Sometimes they'll provide REST APIs that let you pull out little bits of data instead of, whole extractions of, say, CSVs or JSON dumps. So it gets difficult. And then, with some of these vendor products, there's how many requests you can make. It's just a whole mess of restrictions on how you get access to data. But I guess to sum up, I think, there's technical issues in solving data. I think everyone here is probably technical enough to understand, how you can build systems to share data, that those are hurdles that can be overcome. It's the bureaucratic and political hurdles that are so much harder. And technical people can help assist in those, but I feel like it requires a different hat to try to get people in a room to agree to trust each other, and working together to build that trust is the only way you're going to get data shared. So from the technical side, it's this infrastructure. If everyone's working in isolation and views data as a byproduct of their work and data not as an actual product, I don't know that you're going to get data that's shareable. You're not going to get people to want to share data. You have to have this infrastructure to be able to share it, but you have to let people understand that sometimes the data they're creating is their job. It's not just processing these applications. It's the data in these applications and the data about what they're processing that's just as valuable as the applications. I had worked in architecture for a stint, and we were doing these 3D building modeling. It was building information modeling, right? It was this departure from CAD, and it was using objects to build buildings instead of lines. And someone at the Coast Guard made a comment about buildings and said that the information about our buildings is more valuable than the buildings themselves. That the data is sometimes more valuable than the objects it's describing. And I think we need to get that through to a lot of people, that yes, they're doing this job, but the data about their job is just as important, if not more, than their actual job. It's not a byproduct. Open source, when I said I took my dream job, it was my dream job because they basically said, build it. You build it. I don't care how you build it. And I had no money. I had a zero budget. So it was, if you need something, you have to ask for it. So you have to justify it, but there was no set aside budget for me to buy things. So I was locked in this world of, I got to build systems, and I wasn't constrained by contracts and lock in, and I could do what was best. So a couple Linux servers, Elasticsearch, and some Python code, we were able to build systems fast. We were able to see what worked and what didn't, and we were able to share because we weren't locked into anything in particular. And we were trying to create an environment where agencies had systems that could communicate. And by using open protocols and open tools, we were able to. The other option is we just put the entire state on the same system, which is an option, right? But it's really hard to share data when agencies are using completely different systems to manage data and then try to find a way to integrate all these products together. That's where you end up with CSV dumps, right? They can't communicate. No one's going to build a one-off integration. Let's just dump the data somewhere.
Yeah, Paul, this is an excellent articulation. That just sorry to interject, but
Nope.
This is a common thing that we've talked about in this particular group. Is self-interest is pretty powerful. It also can serve you in certain ways, but I guess the question is, how do you get rid of self-interest, but how can you use self-interest to achieve, broader goals across organizations? That's a tough nut to crack. I'd like to hear the group and see what their thoughts are. Maybe something a little bit different take.
I had similar challenges at the federal level. I'm a federal employee, right? I work at the Census Bureau, and I was one of the guys who started actually fed stats about 20 years ago, and was one of the people who were deeply involved with data.gov. And I built a system that networked different agencies together and allowed you to do analysis on the data. We supported every back end that we could find. We used, we didn't use Elasticsearch. We were dealing with statistical data typically and geographic data. So we support all that. We found a technical way to do it. The problem again was, as Andrew's talking about, is this whole incentive thing. In the federal government, the problem, not only within an agency where the funding's the same, what we found, and I worked with other countries. So I worked with Canada, Germany, Mexico, and for example, in Canada, they wanted to let me, because I had CDC data as well as census data. We had all the business data, the inventories, the retail sales, housing starts, plus the poverty, yada yada yada. And the Canadians wanted to have access to our health data. I said, sure, as long as I can get access to yours. They said, we're not going to do that. I said, then there's no way I'm going to do it. And they said, well, in Canada, the Queen has the copyright, so we can't give it to you. And I said, well, then why am I going to give you access to the US data? He says, well, I can take it anyway, because you don't have any copyright on it. I said, have a ball. He never did. It was too much work. But the big problem is not only what we found is that information is power, and everybody wants somebody else's data, but they don't want to give up their data. It's unbelievable how that works every time. And we had also in the federal government, it was a funding problem, much like your competition for grants for the same money. It's a zero-sum game. And in the federal government, you have like the Bureau of Labor Statistics that does unemployment. Census collects the data for BLS to do the unemployment data. I worked at both places. And the problem is you have a different committee in Congress that funds each of these agencies. And you have different interest groups that lobby Congress for money for that funding of that survey, of that data. And so when Census or OMB says, I'm going to put a federal system that nobody knows where any of the data is coming from, you start killing off data sets. Nobody collects the data anymore. And, the citizen says, well, I pay taxes for this. I should be able to get what I want. You don't understand the bureaucratic motivations underneath the table. And if you ignore it, you'll start losing access to data, to health data, to crime data, and everything else. So actually, I was at another meeting, Andrew, that we were talking about using a knowledge base to build an interest graph, to actually map out interest of all the players. So then that we could see, the real underlying political issues, not the announced ones, because the announced ones never match the informal ones, and they seem to contradict it. Anyway, that's all I mentioned.
Yeah, one of the things about interests, if at the federal level, I imagine it's a much larger scale, and when things change, I don't know how much, like when administrations change, I don't know how much that comes down. At the city level, it's so much smaller that when, like, after a mayoral election, it's like, 2 months ahead of time, the new boss is coming in January. Nobody does any work. Everyone stops, and everyone's panicking because you're going to get a new director. And now this new director is either going to fire you or not. Everyone's lobbying to keep their job. But it's like, now the data becomes dangerous because everyone's going to come through all your work. And it's these priorities change. It's like, we used to collect this data, but now these new people are coming in. They don't want to collect that anymore. They want to do this, and this project's going to stop. And then one of the other things I've noticed too in government is a lot of times, sometimes you can get things done because Bob. There's some guy, Bob, in a corner somewhere that's been doing something and knows everything. He's been there for 25 years. And he'll just jail. And somehow I found a guy who was like, I'm willing to work with you, send you booking data every single day. I'll FTP it wherever you want, and I'll work with whoever to get through your firewall. And this guy was jumping through hoops just to give me data. It's like, I almost feel like he's never talked to anybody. No one knows who he is. And it's like you become friends with some of these people who are experts, and they'll move mountains to give you what you want because they like their work and they're doing an amazing job, and they'll share it. But this tends to be some employee that's been there for a long time and probably isn't at a managerial level and isn't necessarily worried about the power. Then when their boss comes in, it may come to an end. But I do find that, like, there's people in government that are brilliant, will do anything, but you got to find this one person, and getting to them becomes really difficult the bigger government gets.
One of the big problems we had with standards committees, I was on several, and finally a mentor of mine shared this with me, and I started using it, is that a lot of the people who go to the standards committees are no longer the technical guys doing the work. They have time to go to the committees. And what this guy was a federal consultant, and he said there's usually one employee that everybody knows, but nobody can find. He's usually hidden away in a closet, and his manager and everything hide him because he's the guy that's doing like 80% of the work. And he's often unappreciated because he's not given the limelight because they're trying to protect him all the time. And he said the key is to be successful in these federal contracts is to find that technical guy that has been hidden away and then get access to him because he'll know all this. And usually he'll want to share it because nobody appreciates him where he's at. You know, he's just he's a tech, he's not dealing with policy or anything like that. But we've had the same thing. I'm dealing with confidential computing, and I went to our state delegates. They want to do something on crime, and what I find is that a lot of the violent crime seems to be an intersection between drugs and mental health and the criminal justice system. So I talked to our state attorney, and I said, well, you guys, are you doing anything about this stuff? And they said, we can't, because it's all confidential information. We can't share stuff between each other. And I said, well, he says, but we're funding everything really well. We're funding all the drug rehab houses really well. We're funding all the mental health really well. But nobody was tracking people who were traveling between each of these. And they didn't know how many people dropped out of the system and then come back into the system, probably criminal justice system, because they've attacked somebody violently because they have a problem with their bipolar or whatever, I don't know. But and they're probably, and a lot of them are doing drugs to help their bipolar or whatever their issues are. And again, I couldn't get the state of Maryland to do anything. They're all doing it the traditional way. They're everything's a bespoke problem. They're basically looking at one problem. We're saying we're going to increase make it easier for people to get out of prison earlier, and then they say, well, we think we need to have more money for mental health, but they don't. There's no linkage. And
yeah, we tried to get health data, and it was like impossible to combine it with criminal data. And one of the things they tried to get was like frequent flyers to emergency rooms. But the jurisdictional thing is a nightmare. It's that every police department in Bernalillo County, we have two. We have a sheriff and a police department, and they both use different systems. It's like, so they can't share data in any meaningful way. We use a different system at the DA's office. They can't share with us, and the public defenders use a different system, and the courts use a different system. And once you leave the county, I could murder 12 people in another county. And once I come to Bernalillo, you have no idea. You arrest me for DUI. You don't know I've killed 12 people in another county, right? Because all my arrest records are over there. You only have APD system. They can't look me up anywhere else unless it makes it to a state system, which it won't, right? It's right. Almost like every jurisdiction is this island.
Right.
Oh, let me ask you.
I'm talking too much. I want somebody else. Alan, somebody.
Yeah, Alan, I'll let you go first if you got something. Otherwise, I'll.
Well, I think this is an excellent statement of the problem, and so it makes me wonder, what's the solution that none of us has discovered yet? And are there best practices in some faraway organization somewhere that we haven't discovered? And I've been working in our little Dataworthy collective with some folks from the Benelux countries and from the Nordic countries, and their culture is more of a sharing culture. And so on the standards front, for example, they're making more progress. And so there have been some, what would appear to be some breakthroughs that others have been struggling to try to get to. So I don't have any suggestions for magic bullets. I was at PwC for 20 years, and like I said, I learned to navigate the informal organization to get work done. And it was a tribal organization because it was a partnership. So you had to calculate who was going to have the power in 2 or 3 years when the leadership changed. And I was also in government for a while at the Office of Naval Research. And really, that was just a disappointing agency because it was founded by Vannevar Bush, who was like a fantastic luminary in the science field during World War II and afterwards. Well, they oversaw contracts and grants at universities, at research universities. And the whole system was just being exploited by many of these universities, and they were basically overcharging for indirect costs. And so the PIs, the principal investigators who were actually winning the contracts and grants, were getting less and less money, and more money was ending up in the administration to do what they wanted to with it, because research universities, even big ones like Stanford, are cash poor. But I just think that the organizational aspect of this is certainly important, and maybe the first step is to do what Paul suggests and say, okay, we have to create a system level organization to begin with. Focus on the system, not on the delegation and the piece parts. And there was a guy at a semantics conference in a previous decade who was at the fire department in some Swedish town or something, and he had the wherewithal to set up this system so that they could track and trace all the vehicles that were going to different places in the town, for example. And he was doing fantastic stuff because he wasn't beholden to the data owners that already existed. He was creating his own data. So sort of starting from scratch with a new project and managing the whole data lifecycle from, with that clean slate seems like another way to sidestep some of these issues. But I've experienced these issues firsthand, so I feel your pain for what it's worth.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm also curious what people think about like the over reliance on IT for data. So I'm not a lawyer. I worked in a law firm, and I was asked to do basically data analytics because I could write Python and I know some stats and I can build websites and I can do what they view data as technology work versus data as domain work, right? Like I'm at the point where I feel like you need a domain specialist that knows how to do data, not a tech person that now has to learn a domain. Like I could take medical imaging MRI data and do stuff with it from a raster perspective. I know how to do raster data. I could do all kinds of stuff. I can't tell you what any of that means. And I don't have the time to get a medical degree to be able to interpret this data. What I need is a specialist in the medical field to be able to interpret their own data as part of their job, right? Like a lawyer should be able to look at data and figure out what their conviction rate is, not necessarily the IT person. I don't know what people think about that, but this idea of like, in business now, even a business person, if you're an accountant, you have to know how to do numbers. You can't say, well, the IT guy does it. It's a spreadsheet. Oh, it's all in a database. Give it to the IT guy and let him calculate, our PDE or whatever. Does anyone I've just seen IT step into these data roles and they don't know anything about the data, but they know data in general.
I have comments, but I want to hear Andrew because he's been
Yeah,
Quiet. Now he's
I
absorbing things still.
that is a common problem. It I let's just assume that Dave McComb's world comes to fruition and that the friction to share data is not an issue. Given that human nature is a constant, does that improve matters at all? Does that improve people's self-interest? I think to a degree it does, but there's still a barrier to be broken. And it may be cultural, as Alan suggests, perhaps in the Nordic countries in Europe, they just have a different perspective when it's amenable to sharing. Should they have the technology that is easily put in people's hands? The self-service type of notion has been pretty elusive up to this point. So I don't know that that's coming soon, although people who scream AI may say otherwise. But I do wonder if we did have a frictionless type of data sharing technology, where would we be? How could we solve the political issue with that to the side? I'll leave it at that.
well, one thing about the frictionless, we built something that I thought was pretty frictionless in terms of the technology. And it allowed you to combine data from different data sets based upon the metadata. The thing that we found the most expensive part of trying to maintain the system was getting the metadata right, getting the documentation right. And we found it really hard in the agencies because we have a bunch of PhDs analyzing the data and specifying the data, but they want the secretaries to specify the metadata. And the concept for the metadata, again, you're saying don't use this definition, only use it this way. For the unemployment data in that data set, there's literally 3 ways that are economically accurate. And I started out as an economist, then went into IT to do unemployment. And they give you different answers, but they want you to use the same definition they've used since 1940, so you can compare numbers. Doesn't make any sense. So I think the big friction is getting the definition of the data. The second thing is that I think that somehow an ecosystem where people find it more valuable to put their money, a nail soup, put their stuff into the common pot and allow themselves to pull the ingredients out. Like you say, this self-help, definition of their reports is better, but I don't think that ecosystem works. And I think the other problem is that technology is changing so quickly that if we specify a given technology, it will fail. Because I had a friend of mine that wanted me going with the company with him, and we're diagramming in software engineering. So we diagram a system and then it would write the system for you. Okay. And I said, this isn't going to last because they're going to come up with new languages that are going to become dominant. And you're going to constantly be trying to write drivers for the new language. And again, Python came out of, I'm old enough that Python's actually relatively new. I don't know if anybody remembers APL. We did APL at one time, but so again, I think the 2 issues we call the data you're talking about administrative data or found data. Again, it's data that wasn't created to estimate something. It's a side effect of a business process. That's some of the richest data. But part of the whole graph issue is the data is most valuable when you understand its context to other business processes. And that's why networking graph databases seem to make sense. Comments?
We tried to push graph data in the criminal justice system we were doing some Neo4j work. We were trying to take police reports and show people how we could take VIN numbers, locations, gun serial numbers, how we could tie all this data together. And I ran a simple example that was able to show a car break-in, a stolen gun, a gun used in another crime, but to link these things across this criminal justice system, because police reports are relational data. It's just, it's rows. Here's a police report and it lives in isolation from any other report, and data entered on multiple reports doesn't get connected. And so graph data has been fascinating, but I feel like, at least where I am here in Albuquerque, trying to explain graph data to people was just like, they love the visuals of it, but I don't think they quite wrap their head around it. And trying to explain to them this context, and I wish they would move in that direction. But again, it's the technology changes so fast. Everyone's still in these databases of, we insert, it's columns and rows, it's relational. To think anything beyond relational is just so difficult. But man, I think for criminal justice data without graphs, it's hopeless.
Yeah. It's interesting though how we've indoctrinated a whole generation on columns and rows. I guess presumably starting with Excel, like that's not an issue, but graph in relationships, which is intuitive, I think, if explained correctly for most people. People think that way, but when you show them the technology, it's like, oh, I don't really get that. But columns and rows, yeah, I understand spreadsheets. That disconnect that happens somewhere between the introduction of spreadsheets and the way people think is interesting to me. How is it that they don't understand that? Maybe I'm too steeped in graph technology at this point, but there seems to be some missing link there. No pun intended.
Yeah, what I'm doing is I'm not explaining graphs to anybody, because I show it to them and they think the little dots and the links are really cool, but they don't really get it. So basically what I did is, I'm using Neo4j. I'm basically focusing with the dashboard builder to build graphics, because that's what they care about. They care about the graphics. And when you're talking about the C-suite, you're always talking to people with an 8th grade education. I mean, that's the thing. You've got to, no matter what degrees they have, they don't know your business, and they only spend 5 minutes on it. So if you can't explain it to an 8th grader in about 10 minutes, they're not going to get it. They're too busy doing other things. And that's a real problem. So I spent a lot of time dumbing things down.
One other hurdle we had here is that New Mexico is an interesting state because we have Albuquerque, which is as urban as it's going to get. But then you have these areas where the DA's offices have 4 employees, and the DA actually prosecutes cases themselves because they don't, there's like 8 crimes a year. And then you have Albuquerque that has 95,000, 40,000 felonies a year, right? So one of our problems with data was explaining to agencies that could literally have the most inefficient process and could do all their work by hand on paper and still have time to watch Netflix for 3 hours a day, to explain to them why they need better technology, because we're on a statewide system and they're quite happy with the system, but they're not at the volume where we are, and they're technically the majority of agencies in the state. So trying to tell somebody who doesn't feel like they need new technology because their volume's so low, but we're dealing with so much data that we have stretched these systems and realized the inefficiencies of the systems, and data becomes more important when you have massive volume of work. And so trying to explain to them that, our crimes don't fit in a spreadsheet. We hit the limit of Excel. And they're like, oh, wow, we still have 65,000 rows. It's different people have different volumes of work and different things they need to do. And trying to explain to someone that deals with 10 events a year why something's no good because you're dealing with 1 million, they can't even comprehend that, right? So they don't really understand what you're talking about.
Right.
Yep.
That's it. It drives me back to that, this idea. This guy who's at Oxford, so I'm lucky enough to know him, and he's running a bunch of academics, and we're involved with supply chains right now. And but this whole and another friend of mine is dealing with, you know, what's called the scientific data sharing problem. You know, the whole, and again, both are dealing with causal graphs, and part of it is, I said, well, it'd be interesting not to think of it as a causal graph, but an incentive graph. You know, and the kind of discussions that you're having, whether you're talking about public, trying to get something published in a journal, you know, from a university, or you're talking at NASA, you know, how do scientists share information? It's the same problem. You have a graph of sharing information, and what are, you know, they're having problems with the incentives for people to share information, and the fact that technology is going to change. You know, can you get a stable API so you can share information and allow the endpoints to evolve in some graceful way that don't contradict each other, and allow you to have some people at one level of technology and other people at another level of technology, and build an incentive system where people tend to grow to a stable center, but you'll always have, you know, the tails will always be a little bit off, you know. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the way government shares data tends to be the lowest common denominator, and we get these massive dashboards that data share, like the open source movement. The open source movement in government went from sharing data to basically providing the tools to analyze the data, and not so much sharing it. These dashboards are now graphs and widgets and charts, which are great for a lot of people who don't know how to use the data. But it's almost, there's, like you said, there's a group of people who are like, just give me this raw data and I'll do what I want with it.
A lot of people.
And then there's this population over here that's like, well, I just want to be able to click a few buttons and see how money in my district is spent. And government is in this horrible position of them, horrible, but they're in this position of they have to serve everybody, and they should probably serve the mass more than the specialists, right? So, and government's doing things that lose money. Like you have a job to provide services, and can't just focus on what's a winner, what makes money, what you have to provide a broad service to everybody and can't exclude people, which means you do have to build systems that are useful to the largest number of people. And these specialist systems and the high tech stuff probably gets kind of pushed to the side.
I've got to leave too.